While most 9-year-olds are learning how to ride bikes or draw in class, Helena is studying legal codes and international treaties, just to protect the right to stay with the only person who's ever truly loved her, her mother. But when her powerful, manipulative father takes her to court not for love, but for money, the world doesn't expect what happens next. This isn't just a custody battle, it's a war of truth against power, and it all begins with a little girl who dares to raise her hand in court and ask to be heard. Stick with us. What happens next will change lives, starting with hers. The moment Helena raised her hand, the courtroom paused, not out of respect, but out of confusion. She wasn't supposed to speak. Children didn't interrupt court proceedings, especially not custody battles this public, this loaded, this performative. The judge, an older man with thinning white hair and an expression that had long ago given up on being surprised by anything, narrowed his eyes behind the bench. He looked at her like one might look at a whisper in the middle of a storm, small, out of place, but unnervingly clear. Her hand remained steady, high, not pleading, not unsure, just certain. Janet, her mother, inhaled sharply but said nothing. Across the aisle, Robert Wellington leaned back in his chair, arms folded with the smug comfort of someone who had paid a fortune for the best attorney in the state and fully expected the system to fold for him again. His gaze didn't land on Helena so much as pass over her as if she were an inconvenient chair left in the hallway. The judge hesitated for a moment too long. "Miss Helena, you wish to speak?" She nodded once, calmly. Her voice didn't tremble. "I do, Your Honor." The attorneys conferred in hurried whispers. Janet's public defender looked horrified. Robert's lawyer wore the smirk of someone waiting for a child to embarrass herself and make his job easier. But the judge, perhaps out of a strange mixture of instinct and weariness, gestured for Helena to come forward. No one guided her, no hand on her back, no voice in her ear. She stepped past the counsel tables alone, her black shoes hitting the wooden floor with quiet purpose. She climbed the platform where expert witnesses usually sat. Her feet didn't touch the ground. She sat upright anyway. "Proceed," the judge said, folding his hands. Helena looked straight at him, and then turned her head slowly to the gallery, past her mother's anxious eyes, past her father's uninterested posture, past the reporters waiting for a headline. And then she spoke. "This is not about who loves me," she began. "This is about a fund." The room stilled. The judge blinked once but said nothing. Helena opened the notebook she carried, small, blue, frayed at the corners. She had written everything down by hand. "There is a trust," she said, "created by my grandmother. It can only be accessed if Mr. Wellington has custody of me. This is why we're here." Gasps didn't erupt. This wasn't television. But there was a shift, a soundless exhale of disbelief. Her voice was level, almost teacher-like as she continued. "I've read the terms. I've read his public financial disclosures. I've read the guardianship clause in his proposal." She paused, just long enough to make people wonder how. "He doesn't want to raise me. He wants to raise the capital he can gain access to through me." At this, Robert finally shifted in his seat, as though he just noticed she was in fact speaking words that hurt. His attorney began to rise, but the judge held up a single hand. "Let her finish," he said quietly. And Helena did. She referenced Title 42, Article 1983. Child Welfare Code provisions, even the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, ratified everywhere but here. She didn't fumble. She didn't apologize. She didn't cry. It wasn't precociousness. It was urgency. Somewhere between memorization and survival, Helena had become fluent in legal self-defense. Her words weren't dramatic, but they cut. "He has no history of parental involvement," she said, her voice quieter now. "He refers to me as the girl in emails I've read." Her fingers trembled once, briefly, but she steadied them. "My mother has worked 2 jobs. She reads with me every night, even when she's too tired to keep her eyes open. She doesn't own a company. She doesn't have power. But she has me." The judge shifted his weight. Something in the room had changed. What had begun as a custody hearing shaped by power and performance was now being reshaped by clarity. Not anger, not vengeance. Clarity. Robert's jaw had tightened, but he said nothing. His lawyer leaned toward him, whispering something that sounded like a warning. Helena turned her gaze back to the judge. "If the law is supposed to serve justice," she said, "then today I ask it to serve truth. You heard mine." And then she closed her notebook. The silence that followed was different, not stunned, but altered. Helena hadn't screamed. She hadn't pleaded for love or cried out for safety. She had done something far more dangerous. She had made sense. Cold, undeniable sense. A narrative that couldn't be buried under procedural objections or expensive suits. The judge leaned forward, elbows on the bench, staring at this girl who had dared interrupt the machine, not with chaos, but with order. Janet's eyes shimmered with a guilt she hadn't earned. Robert looked for the first time, not superior but uncertain. The court clerk's hand hovered over the keys, unsure whether this part counted as official testimony or not. Helena stepped down from the platform as slowly as she had climbed up. She didn't smile. She didn't glance back at anyone. As she returned to her seat beside her mother, the judge finally cleared his throat. "We will take a recess." He struck the gavel once and no one moved. The room wasn't ready to return to anything yet. Helena sat beside her mother in silence. Janet didn't speak, not because she didn't have words, but because she knew anything she said would be smaller than what her daughter had just done. She simply reached for Helena's hand, which the girl allowed. Their fingers interlaced for the first time in what felt like years. In the corner of the room, a reporter finally moved, scribbling frantically. The opposing attorney was on his phone already. Robert sat frozen. Nothing had ended. The case was still open. Arguments would continue. Evidence would be presented, but the tectonic shift had already occurred. For the first time, this wasn't about what adults said was best for a child. It was about what the child demanded for herself. And as Helena's small shoulders rose and fell with a steady breath, the world, at least for a moment, tilted in her direction. She had raised her hand. She had been heard. And no one, not even her father, was prepared for what would come next. When the apartment door closed behind them, it didn't slam, it simply clicked shut, final and quiet, like a breath held too long. Janet moved first, tossing her keys into the bowl near the door, missing it by an inch. The keys clattered onto the floor, but she didn't pick them up. Helena stood still in the narrow hallway, her backpack still on, her shoulders stiff. Not from fear, but from something heavier. Restraint. "You did." "Well," Janet said, though her voice cracked halfway through the sentence. Helena didn't answer. The girl simply walked past her and into the living room, dropped her bag near the couch, and sat with her hands folded in her lap. Janet hovered in the doorway, unsure if she was meant to sit, leave, or fall apart. "Do you want anything?" she asked. Helena shook her head. The truth was, Janet didn't know what to do with her hands, her voice, or her guilt. She'd imagined comforting Helena after the hiring, crying together, maybe. But her daughter hadn't cried, not even once. And now that calm was more terrifying than any outburst could have been. Janet went into the kitchen and began boiling water. Not because Helena had asked for tea, but because it gave her something to do, some task to perform that looked like care. She stared at the rising steam and tried to remember if she had hugged her daughter that morning. She hadn't. She'd been too preoccupied, wrinkled shirt, lost court papers, dry mouth, sleepless eyes. She didn't even remember if she'd told Helena she loved her. That thought alone nearly buckled her knees. In the living room, Helena hadn't moved. Her silence was not cold. It was a kind of waiting. Not for comfort, not for approval, but for space. Space to be herself again after having to carry a weight that wasn't hers. Janet returned with a cup of weak chamomile and placed it in front of Helena on the coffee table. "In case," she said. Helena looked up just once, nodded gently, then looked away again. There were two people in the same room, orbiting around pain, hoping not to collide. Helena didn't cry, but later that evening she wrote. It was what she always did. In the privacy of her room, with the door slightly cracked open so her mother wouldn't worry, Helena pulled the blue notebook from under her bed, the one that no one was allowed to read. Inside there were pages filled with courtroom notes, yes, but also letters she'd never sent, to Janet, to her father, to the judge, to herself. Tonight's entry was short. "I saw her trying today. Not with her words, but in how she watched me. I don't think she knew I noticed." Helena paused, then added, "I wish she'd stop apologizing inside her head and just sit with me." She put the notebook away, stood up and walked into the kitchen. She opened the refrigerator, found the little pad with magnets where her mother usually wrote shopping lists, and scribbled something quickly. She didn't want to say it out loud. Not because she couldn't, but because she didn't need to. The note read, "You don't need to fix it all. Just be here tomorrow." She stuck it on the fridge right under the drawing of a sunflower she'd made in second grade. Janet found the note an hour later. She was doing what she often did after Helena went to bed, quietly rearranging things in the kitchen, as if order could repair what history had damaged. Her eyes fell on the scribbled words, and she leaned against the fridge, hand on her mouth. It wasn't forgiveness, not exactly. It was permission, a way forward that didn't demand perfection, only presence. And Janet could do that. She wasn't sure how to fix what her past choices had done, how to rebuild what had cracked in both of them when Robert returned and tried to play father with a lawyer at his side. But she could be there. She could stay. That night, she didn't drink the wine she usually did to numb the anxiety. She brewed herself the same tea she'd made for Helena. She sat in the darkened living room and imagined her daughter not as the girl who had to be brave in a courtroom, but as the child who once cried over a scraped knee and asked to sleep in her bed. That memory broke something loose. Not regret. Something more fragile. Willingness. Neither of them said "I love you" that night. Neither needed to. Helena fell asleep quickly, her body worn from the quiet intensity of the day, but her mind still spinning. She dreamed not of courtrooms or questions, but of her mother sitting at the kitchen table reading one of her old storybooks aloud, her voice soft, unpolished, human. Meanwhile, Janet stood by Helena's bedroom door for several minutes, watching her sleep. She didn't enter. She didn't fix the blanket. She simply stood there, holding the note from the fridge in one hand. She didn't realize she'd been crying until one of the tears landed on the paper. She folded it carefully, placed it in her pocket, and went back to the kitchen. She didn't sleep much that night. But when the sun rose, she was already dressed for her shift and had written her own note on the back of the envelope from an old bill. She left it on the counter where Helena always sat for cereal. It read, "I'll be home early today. For you." After the hearing, Helena had returned to the small apartment where she lived with her mother. Janet, a worn-out nurse who alternated between night shifts and silences, trying to protect her daughter from the world and from herself. Janet didn't know how to console the girl who had stood taller than most adults that day. She'd already apologized for loving the wrong man. She'd already wept in secret places where Helena wouldn't see. But Helena, who had secretly taught herself case law in the corners of a public library, still processed the world on her own terms. She continued writing her emotions by hand in a notebook she kept hidden beneath her bed, between mother and daughter. There was love, but also a painful distance built not from lack of care, but from the wounds neither dared name aloud. And yet, in the notes Helena left on the fridge, in the chamomile tea Janet brewed without being asked, something unspoken began to form, a fragile bridge made of presence, not apologies. One day at a time, they would begin to rebuild what time had tried so hard to steal. The first time Helena saw her father's face on national television, she didn't feel anger. Not immediately. She felt something colder, recognition. There he was, in front of polished bookshelves that probably no one had ever opened, wearing a navy blue suit that matched the anchor's tie. The headline read, "Robert Wellington Breaks Silence. A Father's Fight for His Daughter." The segment was carefully edited, smiles spliced with pauses. Concern measured into every syllable he delivered. "I just want what's best for Helena," he said, eyes lowered. "No child should be used as a pawn." Helena stared at the screen in the library's back room and said nothing, but inside her something moved. It wasn't rage. It was an old, sharp loneliness resurfacing, the kind that came from being spoken about instead of spoken to. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had been shelving books nearby, muted the screen gently. "You don't have to watch this," she said. Helena replied with a quiet, "I already did." Then she opened her notebook, turned to a clean page, and began writing. Not her thoughts this time, but a list of names she had found over the last week. Names buried in case files and contracts and lawsuits with sealed endings. Names of children. She had begun her search out of instinct. What kind of man would fight so hard for custody without ever having been present? That question led to others, and Mrs. Rodriguez, who understood things without being told, began pulling boxes of newspaper clippings. Old court dockets, digital archives that hadn't been touched in years. Helena came in every day after school, claiming she was working on a civics project. But Mrs. Rodriguez didn't ask questions. She simply brought her tea and unlocked the restricted search terminal, and Helena searched. It was in those hours, in that quiet tension between purpose and disgust, that she began to see a pattern. Small real estate deals that led to evictions, companies absorbed and children displaced, custody battles in which fathers were removed, and where Wellington's name appeared in some financial thread behind the scenes. Nothing overt, nothing criminal on the surface, but enough to show a pattern. One file led her to another and then another until she landed on a case labeled simply Louisa, Anna, age T, terminated custody, relocation, no further information, no follow-up, no photo. The final line read, "Closed per family request." That name stayed with Helena, Anna, Louisa, no last name, no city listed, just a child, erased by legal closure. That night, Helena sat on her bed with the folder open on her lap, staring at the one-page summary like it might bleed the truth if she looked hard enough. Janet knocked on her door, but Helena said she had homework. It wasn't a lie, it just wasn't schoolwork. She traced Anna's name with her finger, then reached for her pen and slowly wrote it in the margin of her notebook just to keep it alive somewhere, just to say someone remembered. "I don't know where you are," Helena whispered to the paper, "but I think someone like him made you disappear." The next morning, before leaving for school, she stood in front of the fridge for longer than necessary, staring at the note Janet had left her. "Don't skip breakfast. I love you." Helena smiled faintly but didn't eat. Her appetite had shifted into something else. She was no longer researching for self-defense. She was investigating out of obligation. Out of a quiet oath she had never spoken aloud. "If I win, I don't win alone." The next time she met Mrs. Rodriguez at the library, she handed her a list of 10 names. "Can you help me find anything more on these?" she asked. The librarian scanned the names, nodded once, and disappeared into the back. There were no questions about why a 9-year-old girl needed access to sealed court archives. No gentle lectures about boundaries, only trust. Helena waited with her notebook open, doodling a sunflower in the margin next to Ana Luisa's name. She didn't cry, she didn't even feel sad. What she felt was heavier, the kind of weight that made you straighten your spine rather than collapse. When Mrs. Rodriguez returned, she carried a box. "Some of these cases are cold," she said, "but I marked the ones with corporate ties." Helena nodded. "Thank you." As she sorted through the files, she noticed patterns in how they were written, how legal language could be used to blur accountability. "Does anyone else see this?" she asked quietly. Mrs. Rodriguez looked at her with an expression that was half pride, half sorrow. "People see," she replied, "but most don't know what they're looking at. You do, and that changed everything." It was late by the time Helena finished assembling her new pages. She'd moved from folders to a full binder now, organizing documents by type, testimonies, financial trails, child welfare reports. She didn't know yet if this would help her in court, but she knew it mattered. She knew that even if it never made it to the judge's desk, it was real, and realness was power. She returned home quietly, placed her binder under the floorboard where the loose tile allowed for hiding things, and crawled into bed without saying much to Janet. She was too tired to talk, too full to speak. But before she turned off the lamp, she reached into her backpack, pulled out her notebook, and under Ana Luisa's name she wrote, "You're not a case number to me." Then she drew a small circle, and inside it wrote, "Promise." That single word felt heavier than all the facts she'd compiled. She closed the notebook and turned out the light. That night, Helena didn't dream of courtrooms or judges. She dreamed of names that would no longer vanish in the fine print. Robert Wellington had appeared on national television in staged interviews, carefully crafting the image of a concerned father. But Helena had uncovered something deeper than surface appearances. She had combed through public records, investigated contracts, and found names of children whose families had been destroyed by his business dealings. With the silent support of the librarian Mrs. Rodriguez, who understood more than she said, Helena built a quiet but damning dossier. And one name among them, Ana Luisa, a girl who disappeared after her father lost custody, stayed with Helena like a shadow. The weight of that name anchored her. It became a quiet vow. Helena didn't know what justice for Anna would look like or whether it was even possible, but she wrote the name in the margin of her notebook. And in doing so, she made herself a promise that this battle, no matter how personal, would never be just for her. Helena didn't stumble upon the trust document by accident. It took 3 days, 5 keywords, and one uncomfortable conversation with a city clerk who only relented after Mrs. Rodriguez used her name and professional ID. The document wasn't hidden, it was simply placed where no one thought a child would ever look. But Helena wasn't just a child anymore. She printed the pages, highlighting clause after clause, not understanding all of it at once, but understanding enough. The trust, created by her paternal grandmother, held over $12 million in assets, real estate, dividends. Cash reserves, all placed under Robert Wellington's name, to be accessed only upon one condition: legal and physical custody of Helena. That was the key. That was the entire game. The revelation didn't feel like betrayal. It felt like confirmation. She hadn't imagined it. She hadn't been paranoid. Her father didn't want her. He wanted the vault she represented. The way someone wants a code, not the safe. She reread the clause: funds to be released in full upon verified custody transfer. Non-contestable. It wasn't personal. That made it worse. This wasn't about revenge or affection. It was about paperwork and money. She folded the pages slowly, deliberately, and sat in silence. When Helena got home that evening, Janet was asleep on the couch with a medical brochure open on her chest. It was for a nurse licensing program she couldn't afford. Helena looked at her mother for a long moment, the heaviness of the trust document still in her hands. She considered waking her, saying something, "He's not fighting for me. He's fighting for a loophole," but Janet had aged too quickly in the last few months, and Helena didn't want to give her another burden to carry that night. Instead, she went to her room and pulled out a sheet of letterhead paper. She'd stolen it from her school principal's office 2 weeks ago, pretending she needed it for a history project. It had the kind of formality she wanted for this letter. She didn't start with "Dear Judge." She started with, "Before you decide where I live, you should know what my father stands to gain." The letter wasn't dramatic, it was precise. She cited the trust clause, explained its condition, and described how none of Robert's legal motions had come until after the trust became active. Her handwriting was careful, almost too neat for a child. But she was no longer just a child in this story. She was evidence. Helena stopped halfway through the letter, her pen hovering above the page. A question had surfaced, one she hadn't dared ask until now. If he had gotten custody, what would he have done with me? She stared at that invisible question, trembling at its implications. Would she have been sent away to some boarding school overseas? Left with staff and strangers while he liquidated the assets? Would he have visited her once a month just to meet the legal minimum, just enough to keep the money flowing? She couldn't answer, and she didn't want to know. But she needed to finish the letter. This wasn't about fear. It was about making sure no other child got turned into a line item. She picked the pen back up. "My mother has no inheritance, no backup plan. But she has loved me without expecting a payout. I think that matters more than money. I hope you do too." She didn't cry while writing it, but something in her heart cracked a little, like the quiet shifting of a foundation before a house settles deeper into the earth. When the letter was done, she folded it into thirds, placed it in an envelope, and sealed it, though she wasn't ready to give it to anyone yet. She stared at the sealed envelope for a long time. It sat on her desk like a secret too big for her small room. She didn't know why she hesitated. She had the judge's clerk's name. She knew where the office drop box was. But something told her this letter had to wait. Not because the truth wasn't ready, but because she wasn't. There was still something more to understand, something more to prepare for. She didn't want this letter to be a warning shot. She wanted it to be the closing argument. Helena took the envelope and walked to the small bookshelf at the corner of her room. She scanned the titles until she found it. The Girl Who Saved the Day. The book was frayed, its spine broken from being read so many times it could barely stand. It was a children's novel, but to Helena it had always been more than that. It was the story she had told herself when reality felt too loose, too unstable. She opened the book to her favorite chapter, where the girl decides to speak up, even when the adults refuse to listen, and gently tucked the envelope inside. Then she closed it firmly. It was safe there. For now. Janet woke later that night and found Helena in the kitchen making a sandwich with too much mustard. "You hungry?" she asked, rubbing her eyes. Helena nodded but didn't turn around. "Yeah." Janet didn't press her. She poured them both a glass of milk, placed it beside Helena, and sat across the table. For a moment, they ate in silence. And then, just before they finished, Helena asked, "Did you ever meet my grandmother?" Janet blinked, surprised. "Only once. At the hospital, after you were born." She wasn't interested. Helena looked down. "She left me a lot of money, but only if he takes me." The words were delivered plainly. No dramatics, no accusation. Janet's mouth opened, then closed. She wanted to say so many things. That Helena wasn't a prize. That love couldn't be bought. That she wished she'd never let Robert back in. But instead, she reached across the table and placed her hand over Helena's. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "You don't deserve this kind of choice." Helena nodded. She didn't cry, but the pressure in her chest eased slightly, like a knot loosened just enough to breathe. Helena had discovered the trust, or multi-million-dollar fund created by her paternal grandmother, only accessible if her biological father obtained custody. The legal clause changed everything. Suddenly it was clear Robert didn't want Helena. He wanted the money. So the girl, steady and composed, wrote a letter to the judge. She didn't deliver it yet, but she folded it with care and placed it inside the book she had read the most. The Girl Who Saved the Day. Helena was ready to become that girl. But first, she knew before anything else she would have to face the shadow standing between her and the light. The man's name was Victor Salgado. He had worked for Wellington Holdings for over a decade, mostly in logistics and asset consolidation, just enough distance from the boardroom to stay uninvolved, but close enough to know things no one else dared speak aloud. Helena had found him through a financial audit document buried in the city's open records. She noticed his signature repeated across 5 different transactions involving the company's transition funds, paperwork connected indirectly to her father's trust account. She waited outside his apartment building for 2 afternoons before she caught him on his way to his car. At first, he refused to stop. "I don't talk to kids," he muttered, not cruelly, but as if he were trying to protect both of them. But Helena stepped in front of him. "You do," she said firmly. "Because I'm not asking for gossip. I'm asking for what you saw." Victor's eyes darkened. "I didn't see anything," he said too quickly. She tilted her head. "You don't have to lie to me. But if you do, just remember, I'll still be watching." That line made him pause. Something in her voice didn't match her age. It sounded like someone who already knew how the world worked and was tired of waiting for adults to do the right thing. Victor didn't call her, but 3 days later he left an envelope for her at the reference desk of the library. No name, just a note. "Only listen alone. You'll know what to do." Inside was a silver pen drive and nothing else. Helena's hands shook when she took it back to her room that evening. She didn't plug it in right away. For 2 hours she paced the small space between her bed and the wall, playing out every possibility. Maybe it was a fake, maybe it was a trap. Maybe it was exactly what she feared and what she needed. Finally she sat down, plugged it into the second-hand laptop Mrs. Rodriguez had helped her borrow from the community resource desk, and hit play. The audio wasn't long, less than 7 minutes, but it was enough. It was her father. His voice was unmistakable, steady and sharp. "We need to keep her somewhere quiet for the first few months. Boarding school, something out of the way. Should be a formality by then. The trust pays out in full once custody clears. After that, we manage public perception, move the funds into neutral holdings, and deal with the mother politely or not." Helena stopped the audio. She hadn't even noticed her own breathing had vanished. She replayed it again, this time with headphones. She needed to hear every inflection, every unspoken decision hidden in the pauses. There was no trace of affection in his voice, no hesitation. It's business. Cold, precise, cruel. Her presence in his life was a strategy, not a relationship. When he said deal with the mother, his tone didn't spike in anger, it remained flat. As though her mother, her only true parent, was an obstacle to be quietly erased. Helena clutched the headphones tighter to her ears. She didn't cry. She didn't flinch. But the silence between each of his sentences felt louder than anything else. The words were horrifying, yes, but it was the certainty in his voice that stayed with her. There was no room for doubt. He had made his plans carefully, methodically. She listened to the entire file 3 times before finally removing the headphones. Her hands were stiff from gripping them. Her body hadn't moved. Only her mind had traveled, and it had arrived somewhere new, a place beyond pain, a place called resolve. Janet knocked on the door an hour later, calling her for dinner. Helena said she wasn't hungry, and Janet, sensing something in her tone, didn't insist. Helena took the pen drive, wrapped it in a piece of soft cloth, and placed it inside the false bottom of her desk drawer. She didn't want to hide it out of fear, she just wanted it to be there when the time came. Because now it wasn't a matter of if she would use it, only when. She pulled out her notebook next, flipping past the names, past the trust clause, past her drafted letter to the judge. On a fresh page, she wrote only one sentence. Evidence is not revenge. It's protection. She underlined the word protection twice, slowly. It wasn't about hurting him. That would be easy. What was hard, what truly mattered, was stopping him. Making sure the system saw what she had seen, heard what she had heard, and had no choice but to act. But it had to be at the right time, not when emotions were high, not when she was still shaking. This wasn't about emotion. This was strategy. She had learned from him, but not the lesson he thought he was teaching. Later that night, Helena stood by the window, arms crossed, watching rain streak down the glass. Her mind played the recording again, involuntarily. The way her father had said boarding school, the way his lawyer had laughed, not nervously but knowingly. The way money had been the center of every sentence, while her name was used only once, and never with affection. Never with care. She didn't feel sorry for herself. That phase had passed weeks ago. What she felt now was something deeper, something close to fury, but quieter. It didn't want to scream. It wanted to build. Helena thought of Ana Luisa again, of the other names in her notebook. What if there had been recordings for them? What if someone had documented the truth before it was too late? She didn't want this evidence to rot in a drawer, but she didn't want to waste it either. She had one chance to use it right. She had to wait for the court. For the moment when silence would no longer serve her. When she could break it and burn the lie down in front of everyone who ever believed it. On a rainy afternoon, Helena had convinced a former employee of her father's, a man who wore guilt like a second skin, to hand over a pen drive. Inside was a recording, Robert Wellington speaking with his attorney, detailing a plan to send Helena to a distant boarding school, to use her as a pretext to move the trust funds, and to handle the rest once the money was secured. His voice was unmistakable, calculated, cruel. And when Helena heard those words in the silence of her bedroom, she didn't cry. She simply closed her eyes, pressed the headphones tighter against her ears, and made a decision. She would reveal it, but in her own way, and in her own time. The second hearing felt nothing like the first. From the moment Helena and Janet stepped through the courthouse entrance, hand in hand, it was clear this wasn't just a legal proceeding anymore, it was an event. Journalists waited outside, cameras flashing, murmurs rippling through the hallway like a current no one could stop. Helena squeezed her mother's hand tighter, not out of fear, but to keep them both grounded. Janet leaned down slightly, whispering, "You don't have to do anything you're not ready for." Helena didn't answer. She looked straight ahead and walked forward. Inside the courtroom, rows of seats were packed. Reporters, observers, and staffers from organizations she hadn't even heard of filled every space. On the bench, the same judge from the first hearing sat straighter when he saw her. This time, Helena didn't have to raise her hand. She was called forward. "Miss Helena Wellington," the clerk announced, and the room quieted instantly. Her footsteps felt heavier now, but her gaze didn't drop. She approached the witness seat again, but this time she didn't sit down. She stood, notebook in one hand, flash drive in the other. The judge leaned forward, brows furrowed. "Do you have something for the court?" She nodded. "Yes, Your Honor, I do." She handed the drive to the bailiff without trembling, but her fingers, just before letting go, clenched slightly around the device. The judge signaled for it to be played immediately, without sidebar, without delay. As the tech team set up the audio, Robert leaned in toward his attorney, whispering something furious. The attorney whispered back, not as confidently as before. Helena watched from her place near the front, standing tall, her shoulders drawn back, but her heart was pounding. Janet sat behind her, barely breathing. The courtroom, a moment ago buzzing with quiet energy, grew silent as the audio began. Robert's voice, clear and unmistakable, filled the room. "We need to keep her somewhere quiet for the first few months. Boarding school, something out of the way." The lawyer in the recording chuckled faintly. "Once custody clears, the trust pays out," Robert continued. "Then we move the money, neutral holdings, deal with the mother if we have to, politely or not." A collective inhale passed through the room, but no one dared speak. Helena stared at her father. He wasn't looking at her. He was frozen, blinking, his mouth slightly open, as if he hadn't thought he'd ever hear his own cruelty played back so plainly. The recording continued for another minute. The tone was calm, transactional, Robert discussing his own daughter like a step in a financial plan. No remorse, no hesitation. When the audio ended, no one clapped, no one gasped. It was worse than that. There was just silence, dense, suffocating silence. Helena could feel it pressing down on her, but she stood in it anyway, unshaken. The judge removed his glasses slowly. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes flicked briefly to Robert, then to Helena. He cleared his throat, not to speak, but as if bracing himself to say what came next. Helena knew she had done what she came to do. She didn't feel victorious, just necessary. Necessary like a lock breaking open. The judge leaned back slightly and said, not loudly but with complete authority, "We will suspend this session. I am ordering a full review of all guardianship claims, trust documentation, and financial motivations presented by the petitioner. Further, I am requesting an ethics inquiry into legal counsel conduct." Robert stood abruptly, knocking over the small water cup in front of him. "Your Honor, this is, but the judge raised a single hand. "You may be quiet now, Mr. Wellington. The court has heard enough." Janet rushed forward to meet Helena as she stepped down from the front. "You did it," she whispered, clutching her daughter's arm. "You really..." But she stopped herself because Helena wasn't smiling. She looked calm but not joyful. What she had done wasn't about winning. It was about stopping something wrong from continuing unchecked. Janet seemed to understand. She hugged her tightly without needing words. Around them, the room buzzed back to life, judicial clerks shuffling papers, reporters scrambling to confirm what they had just heard. But Helena didn't hear them. She was staring at Robert, who remained standing by his table, staring into nothing. He looked older all of a sudden, smaller, as if her voice, her recording, had taken something from him that he thought no one could reach. Not money, not image, but certainty. Helena had shown the world what he had worked so hard to hide, and he had no script for that. No press statement could erase what they had all just heard. And that, Helena realized, was the real turning point. The judge exited the bench quietly. The bailiff called the courtroom to order once more, but only as a formality. No one was truly in control of the room anymore. Helena and Janet stepped out together, reporters waiting just beyond the doors. Someone shouted her name, another asked for comment. But Helena didn't stop. Not yet. This wasn't a moment for microphones. It was a moment for silence. The powerful kind. The kind that follows truth. Janet glanced down at her. "Do you want me to answer for you?" Helena shook her head. "No. Let them write what they heard." And they walked hand in hand past the crowd, not towards safety, but towards something more enduring: clarity. Inside the courtroom, Robert remained seated, the reality slowly settling into his bones. His team was already on the phone, scrambling. But it was too late. The court had heard the second voice, the voice that mattered more than all the prepared statements. More than the suits, more than the money. The second hearing had come. The courtroom was full, journalists, cameras, hushed voices. Helena entered holding Janet's hand. The judge recognized her immediately, but this time she didn't have to ask to speak. She was called forward. Her heart raced and her notes trembled in her hands as she submitted the recording. When it played, the silence that followed was absolute. When it ended, the judge took a deep breath and said, "We will suspend this session." Robert jumped up, trying to protest, but it was too late. The world had heard it. The girl had conquered her fear. The video wasn't meant to go viral. It had been submitted to the court as evidence, not broadcast material. But someone, maybe a junior clerk, maybe a reporter in the back row, had clipped the audio and posted it alongside a still image of Helena at the stand. Within hours, it spread. Within a day, it became something else entirely. The girl who faced the court read one headline. "The child who exposed power," said another. Talk shows ran segments. Schools invited psychologists to discuss children's rights. Lawmakers mentioned her name in press conferences, linking her voice to proposed reforms. But Helena didn't care about any of it. She just wanted to sleep through the night without thinking about how her words were now public property. At school, students whispered as she passed. Teachers, unsure how to treat her, toggled between reverence and awkwardness. "You're brave," one girl told her. Helena gave a half smile but didn't answer. Bravery wasn't the point. Survival was. And even that felt unfinished. Janet noticed the shift quickly. She came home one evening, saw Helena staring at the television, volume muted, subtitles trailing her own name, and walked over. "Turn it off," Janet said gently. "You don't have to be anything for them." But Helena shook her head. "I know, but I do have to be something for the others." Janet sat beside her, unsure. What others? Helena didn't take her eyes off the screen. The ones who don't get to speak. The ones who still think they can't. That night, she brought up the idea for the first time at the kitchen table, scribbling it out on napkins and loose leaf paper. A legal support program, she explained. For kids, not just lawyers for them, but people with them. To help them understand their own cases, know their rights, not feel like pieces being moved around. Janet blinked, overwhelmed. "You're 9, Helena shrugged. "So?" And it was in that shrug that Janet saw the truth. Helena wasn't doing this for attention or to feel powerful. She was doing it because not doing it felt like betrayal by the end of the week. They had the beginning of a plan. Mrs. Rodriguez joined immediately. She knew which attorneys in the city would listen, and which ones would just smile and dismiss it. Helena made a list. Janet emailed friends. A seed was planted, not by the media, but by a girl tired of waiting. The first meeting happened in the library's community room. There were only 4 people: Helena, Janet, Mrs. Rodriguez, and a young legal aid volunteer named Kamal who had followed the court case online and reached out asking how to help. They didn't talk about strategy that day. Instead, Helena asked a simple question: what would have helped me sooner? The answers came in fragments: someone to explain the legal words, someone to talk to before court, someone to remind her that she wasn't crazy for seeing through lies. Mrs. Rodriguez suggested creating a printed guidebook, something simple with illustrations and real stories. Kamal offered to draft sample pages. Janet committed to organizing future meetings, even though she barely had time between shifts. "We don't need a foundation," Helena said. "We just need a reason," and they had it. That night, they created an email account, a shared drive, and a flyer for their first outreach effort. Know your rights for kids. By kids. It wasn't polished, it wasn't legalese, but it felt real. Helena felt real. For the first time in months, she didn't fall asleep feeling like a symbol. She felt like a person against someone who was building, not just reacting. As the project took shape, so did Helena. At school, she stopped shrinking. When teachers tried to tiptoe around her, she started volunteering in class again. She didn't want to be a celebrity, she wanted to be a resource. She spoke to a group of middle schoolers about what custody really meant. Not with legal definitions, but with human ones. It's not about who owns you, she told them. It's about who listens to you. The kids clapped, some asked questions, and one boy waited after everyone left just to say thanks. My parents are splitting up and I thought I wasn't allowed to feel anything. Helena looked at him and said, "You are. You're allowed to feel everything." Moments like that became her oxygen, not the headlines. Meanwhile, Janet kept the house steady. She filtered calls, rejected interviews, and stood guard like a quiet wall. But even she noticed how her daughter was healing, not because the media praised her, but because Helena was choosing who she wanted to be, and it wasn't anyone else's version of heroism. The name Helena began to appear in places they hadn't expected: grant applications, child welfare blogs, school board discussions. Politicians tried to align themselves with her, but Helena refused every invitation. "If I go," she told Janet, "it stops being about the kids and starts being about me." Still, her message moved. What began as one girl's testimony had become the foundation for a grassroots shift in how people viewed children's roles in legal processes. Mrs. Rodriguez, now acting as the group's informal coordinator, updated the library's bulletin board weekly with stories from kids who had reached out. Some were local, others came from other states. One girl from Oregon sent a thank you letter with hand-drawn hearts. Another sent a copy of her own custody ruling, annotated with notes saying, "I knew what they meant this time." Helena pinned both letters above her desk. They weren't trophies, they were reminders. "They're why I can't stop," she told Kamal one day. He nodded and added, "And why no one else will either." The program didn't have a big name or funding yet, but it had roots. And Helena finally had purpose beyond defense. The video had gone viral. Helena had become a symbol. Her face was on headlines, her courage discussed in schools, her name used by politicians. But she didn't want any of it. She just wanted rest. Janet, seeing how the spotlight circled her daughter, tried to shield her from the weight of it all. Yet Helena didn't retreat. Instead, she built something new, a legal support initiative for children entangled in court battles. With the help of Mrs. Rodriguez and volunteer attorneys, the project took its first breath. It started small. But for the first time, Helena no longer saw herself as a victim. She had stepped into something larger. She had become part of the change. The fall didn't happen all at once. It came in pieces: court filings, asset freezes, partners backing out one by one. Robert Wellington's name, once a symbol of untouchable corporate power, came synonymous with calculated manipulation and parental betrayal. The media, once eager to amplify his narrative of a concerned father, now dissected his financial motives with brutal clarity. Former employees came forward. So did former clients. Lawsuits multiplied. His assets, properties, stocks, overseas accounts were frozen pending investigation. His closest business partners distanced themselves with rehearsed statements. All denying knowledge, all protecting their own reputations. Helena heard about it not from the news but through Kamal, who quietly forwarded her the court press release. She read it once, said nothing, and slid the phone across the table. Janet looked at her and asked, "How does it feel?" Helena shrugged. Expected, but beneath that calm response was something else. It wasn't satisfaction. It wasn't revenge. It was something colder, heavier, recognition of what power looks like when it collapses. She had pulled the thread, and the empire had unraveled. Then came the letter, not addressed to Helena personally, but published in a national newspaper's Sunday edition, a full-page open letter from Robert Wellington. It was an attempt at damage control disguised as paternal remorse. "To my daughter, whom I've lost," it began. The words were polished, just vulnerable enough to pass for authentic, written clearly with the help of a PR firm. He spoke of mistakes, of the pain of being misunderstood, of growing up without a good model of fatherhood. He called Helena brilliant, brave, and mine always. He didn't mention the trust. He didn't mention the recording. He didn't acknowledge that he'd used her like a key to unlock his inheritance. The letter concluded with, "I hope one day you can forgive me. Not for my sake, but for yours." Helena read it in full while sitting on the floor of her bedroom, legs crossed, expression blank. Janet stood nearby, unsure whether to offer comfort or space. When Helena finished, she folded the page carefully and placed it in the recycling bin. "It's not real," she said. "He's just scared." She didn't sound angry, only tired. But later that night when she was alone, Helena found herself scrolling through old court documents again, not the new cases, not the headlines, but back through the scanned copies of her father's earlier ventures. She was trying to remember if there had ever been a time he had done something without expecting a return. A moment where he had simply shown up not as a strategist, not as a CEO, but as a father. She couldn't find one. And yet, when she clicked on one of the older files, a small, unrelated photo appeared, a scanned image, barely legible. It showed Robert at maybe 18, standing next to his mother, Helena's grandmother, the woman who had created the trust. They were standing in front of a modest house, both smiling awkwardly, like people unsure of how to be close. Robert's arm hovered near his mother's shoulder, not quite touching it. Helena stared at the image, something shifting in her chest. It's not sympathy, but understanding. She saw in that photo a boy trying to become a man without knowing how, a young version of the man who would one day choose wealth over love and believe that was normal. The photo stayed with her. It didn't justify anything. It didn't excuse the betrayal or undo the damage. But it reframed it. Some people, she realized, didn't become villains because they were born cruel. They simply chose the wrong compass, over and over, until they no longer knew they were lost. Robert had built a world on transactions, thinking it would earn him permanence. He had chosen power over presence, reputation over relationship, and now he had none of it. But the tragedy wasn't his downfall, it was that even at his lowest, he still didn't know how to choose differently. Helena placed the photo in a folder she didn't label. She didn't want to keep it as a memory, but as a reference, a reminder, not of who he was, but of who she would never be. Janet found her standing by the window later, arms folded, quiet. "You okay?" she asked. Helena didn't answer immediately. Then he could have chosen differently. Janet nodded. "Yes, but you still can." The next morning, Helena printed something new and taped it above her desk beside the letters from other kids. It was just a single sentence, typed in bold. "I am not the echo of his choices." She didn't show it to Janet. She didn't announce it to the volunteers or post it online. It wasn't a declaration for the world. It was a commitment to herself. She wouldn't become cynical. She wouldn't stop trusting, even if she trusted carefully. The project moved forward. A second meeting was planned. More lawyers were joining. A law student from New Jersey reached out asking to translate their guidebook into Spanish. Helena replied personally, thanking her. She didn't mention her father in any part of her day. Not as an anecdote, not as motivation. He was becoming a closed chapter, not erased, but no longer in control of the narrative. She had taken the pain and turned it outward, not in anger, but in architecture. She wasn't trying to undo the past. She was building something that didn't repeat it. Robert had been sued, his assets were frozen, his business partners had fled. He tried to reach Helena through the media, publishing an open letter. Helena read it but didn't respond. And still, when she saw a photograph of him as a young man standing beside the grandmother who had created the trust, something inside her softened. It wasn't forgiveness. It was understanding. Some people spend their lives chasing power when they could have chosen love. And Helena chose, with quiet certainty, never to repeat that story. Helena sat backstage, legs dangling off the folding chair, her note cards held tightly between her fingers. The conference had started hours ago, experts discussing policy, legal reform, trauma response. They had invited her because she'd lived it, because she had become the story behind the new policies being debated. She didn't like the attention. It wasn't who she was. But when the invitation arrived, formal letterhead, a personal message from the event director, she'd stared at it for days before finally whispering to Janet, "Should I go?" Janet had looked at her quietly, then said, "Only if you're going for the kids who can't." That decided it. And yet now that she was minutes from taking the stage, her stomach twisted. What if she froze? What if they expected a hero's speech? What if she opened her mouth and nothing came out? Janet, sitting in the front row, caught her eye through the curtain. She smiled softly, nodding once, not pushing, not expecting, just present. That grounded Helena more than anything. She took a slow breath, tucked the note cards into her pocket, and when her name was called, she stood and walked out into the light. Not as a child performing, but as someone who had lived through something and come back not to impress, but to speak. She stood behind the podium, too short for the microphone, until someone adjusted it. The room waited. Journalists, students, advocates, lawyers, all watching her. But she didn't feel like prey. She didn't feel like a case. She felt real. Helena leaned in and said, "I was never supposed to be in charge of anything. But the adults around me kept leaving the truth behind, and I couldn't leave it there with them." The room didn't erupt. It leaned in. She told her story simply, not in dramatic beats, but in fragments. How she discovered the trust, how she pieced together financial documents in a public library, how Mrs. Rodriguez helped her without asking why, how Janet never tried to rewrite the past, only show up for the present, how the courtroom hadn't felt like a battlefield but like a hallway she needed to walk through alone. I'm not brave every day, she admitted, but I'm learning that being scared doesn't make you weak, it makes you human, and humans can still choose what to do next. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She just stood there, her voice steady, not because she had practiced, but because it was the only way she knew how to stay honest. For most of the talk, Helena didn't look at the crowd. She looked at her words. But near the end, when she spoke about what came after, the letters from other kids, the first meeting of her program, the boy who whispered thank you in a hallway, she looked up. And there in the third row, a girl, maybe 7, maybe 8, sat clutching a small notebook, staring back at her like she was watching someone build a door where there had only been a wall. Helena smiled at her. Not big, just enough. And then came the questions. Some from adults, technical and full of jargon. Helena answered them politely but briefly. Then the moderator called on one last hand, a small one raised in the middle of the audience. The little girl stood, nervous but determined. Do you ever get scared it could happen again? She asked, voice thin but audible. Helena's heart caught in her throat. Could have answered in a dozen different ways: legal statistics, therapeutic responses, structural reforms. But she didn't. She just let herself feel the question fully. She took a breath, the kind that feels like pulling air through a doorway you built yourself. And then she answered, yes, I do. I get scared a lot. But now I know what to do with that fear. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. The room understood. The moderator tried to close the session, but the applause came first. Slow, real, rising like something earned, not demanded. Helena stepped down from the stage and walked back to her seat next to Janet. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't carrying a weight. She was carrying clarity. And Janet, who had spent months watching her daughter fight, break, rebuild, reached over and took her hand. There were tears in her eyes, but not the kind that come from sadness. These were the tears of witnessing something whole. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. For the first time, they were sitting side by side, not one shielding the other, not one holding back. Just mother and daughter together, present, whole. After the conference ended, several attendees tried to approach Helena, activists, educators, people offering interviews and follow-ups. Janet gently shielded her, walking her toward the exit without hurrying her. Outside, under the shade of a tree, they sat for a few minutes on a bench, breathing in silence. You did good, Janet finally said. Helena turned to her, cheeks flushed but eyes clear. I didn't do it to be good, she replied. Did it to stay real. Janet nodded. That's better. There was no rush to go home, no pressure to plan what came next, just the quiet understanding that something had closed and something else had opened. The girl who had once sat in a courtroom, hands trembling, fighting to be heard, had now stood in front of a full audience and told her truth, not for validation, but for the ones still waiting to be heard. She didn't feel older. She didn't feel famous. She felt rooted. For once, she didn't wonder who was watching or what they expected. She had spoken, not to be praised, but to make space for others. Helena had been invited to speak at a conference on children's rights. She was afraid. She hesitated. But she stepped onto the stage. And when she told her story calmly, truthfully, without decoration, a little girl in the audience stood and asked, Are you afraid it could happen again? Helena smiled, took a breath, and answered, Yes. But now I know what to do with that fear. In the audience, Janet wiped away tears. For the first time, mother and daughter sat there whole and free. Months had passed, not quickly, not easily, but with the quiet weight of things finding their place. The apartment Helena and Janet lived in still had the same square footage, the same creaky kitchen cabinet, the same small window that caught the morning light a few minutes longer in spring. But everything else had changed. The shelves, once sparse, were now overflowing, books stacked horizontally and vertically. Some borrowed, some gifted, many underlined in pencil with Helena's precise handwriting. The refrigerator door had become a mosaic of crayon drawings, post-it notes, thank you cards from children across the country, and one small Polaroid of Helena holding the microphone at the conference, her expression both nervous and determined. It wasn't curated, it was lived in, and it showed. Janet, who had once walked on eggshells around her daughter's silence, now found herself caught in quiet conversations about school, about laws, about trust. Helena no longer whispered her thoughts only into notebooks. She had found her voice, and with it, the courage to let people in. The apartment was no longer just a place they stayed. It was a place that reflected them. The before and after of a war neither had chosen, but both had survived. On a Saturday afternoon, while organizing a box of unsorted papers, Janet found the letter Helena had written to the judge months earlier, the one she had never sent. The one she had folded with care and placed inside the girl who saved the day. The paper was worn at the edges, but intact. Janet read it slowly, as if touching something sacred. There were no legal terms, no arguments, just a plea written in a child's voice, but with a depth that still made her breath catch. "Please let me stay where I am loved." It ended. That was it. No anger, no accusations. Just a truth that had changed everything. Janet wiped her eyes and reached for a simple wooden frame. She slid the letter in and hung it next to the entrance, just above the light switch. It wasn't decoration. It was history. Helena noticed it when she returned from the library and stood there quietly, reading it again as if it had been written by another version of herself. She didn't say anything. She just nodded. And in that nod, Janet saw the girl she had feared she might lose, the one who had chosen to fight. Not with rage, but with reason. The one who had come back to stay. Later that day, Helena placed a small wooden plaque on the bookshelf. It had arrived in the mail, carved by a boy from another city who had written her after seeing her testimony online. The words were simple: "Now I am heard." She had smiled when she opened it, not the kind of smile that fades quickly, but the kind that anchors something inside you. She didn't ask Janet for permission to display it. She didn't need to. She placed it between two books, one a novel, one a binder full of letters from other children, and stepped back to make sure it was visible. That plaque wasn't just for her. It was for Anna Louisa, for the kids in courtrooms who still sat alone. For the quiet ones, the angry ones, the confused ones. For the kids who had been told in 1,000 different ways that what they said didn't matter. Helena hadn't won a battle. She had opened a door, and now that door stayed open. She no longer needed to scream to be believed. Her presence was enough. Her words had echoed, and more importantly, they had landed. There were still bad days. Times when she didn't want to explain her story, when the interviews felt invasive, or when memories pulled her back into cold rooms and hard chairs. But there were fewer of them now, and she was learning to give herself permission to step away when needed. Janet never asked her to do more than she wanted. In fact, sometimes it was Janet who insisted she say no. "You are not a symbol," she would remind her. "You are a girl. My girl." Helena didn't resist that anymore. Being a symbol had its uses, but being someone's daughter, someone's person, meant far more. On evenings when the pressure felt heavy, Janet would make tea without asking. Helena would bring her homework to the table without being told. And in that quiet choreography, they had rewritten what family looked like. Not perfect, but chosen, earned, and sacred. They had faced down a man who saw love as leverage. And they had emerged with something stronger than victory. They had found peace. Outside, the world remained imperfect. The news still broke her heart sometimes. Laws changed slowly. Injustices echoed louder than they should. But inside their apartment, inside their shared life, a different rhythm played. Children wrote to Helena asking how to speak up. Teachers asked her what helped. Law students reached out to volunteer. The program she'd co-created with Mrs. Rodriguez was growing, slowly, intentionally. Helena wasn't trying to change the whole system anymore. She was building small things that lasted. Safe rooms in courthouses. Booklets for children, explaining their rights. Circles where no one was rushed to speak. That, she realized, was how real change happened. Not all at once, but one page at a time. One child at a time. She still kept the old notebook under her bed, but now it was filled with plans instead of fears. Helena had learned that home wasn't just a place or a person, it was a decision to stay, to listen, to choose kindness without letting go of truth. Months had passed, and Helena's apartment no longer felt temporary. It was hers, and it was enough. There were books everywhere, drawings on the walls, and letters from children she had unknowingly helped. Janet hung a frame by the door, the first letter Helena ever wrote to the judge. And on a quiet Sunday, Helena placed a small wooden plaque on the shelf. It read, "Now I am heard." Outside, the world was still unfair, but inside, the promise had been kept. Helena was no longer a lost girl. She'd become home first for herself, and then for everyone she chose to love. We put a lot of heart into each story we share. Here's stories that are meant to touch, inspire, and stay with you. If this video moved you or reminded you of something close to your heart, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. by subscribing to our channel. You're not just following content, you're helping us continue to bring more of these meaningful stories to life. Every script takes days of research, writing, and care, all done thinking about you, our community. So take a moment to subscribe, leave a like if this video spoke to you, and feel free to explore more of our stories here on the channel. You are part of this journey, and your support means more than you can imagine. Thank you for being here with us. We're already working on the next story. I see you very soon.